Afternoon. I'm Doug Van Houweling. I'm delighted to see all of you here. We're going to have an interesting afternoon presentation. Before we get started, though, let's see if I can make this go to the next page. So somebody is going to help me here. Trying to get it to go to the next page.
Oh, just hit the arrow key there.
That key.
Oh, it's not working for you, huh?
There we go.
There we go. Should be good now. There you go. Sorry about that.
Okay. So we're getting started a little bit early so that we have more time for your questions and the presentation. What I want to do is, first of all, talk to you a little bit. A number of you, I imagine most of you, are at our collaboratory kickoff, at which point we asked you which work group you would like to be involved in. I just wanted to give you some feedback about that. Here you can see how the distribution of people sort of spread out across the various work groups. Actually, it's a pretty good balance. We have a smaller group who are interested in sort of helping us work on the large-scale funding, but that's probably entirely appropriate. We sort of needed kind of an executive committee to figure out how to pursue the various funding opportunities, so I think that will work out, although we may wind up drafting one or more of you to help us round that group out as we get into it. We'll be kicking off the work group activity after the first of the new year. So you can expect to hear more about this as we go forward in the new year. We also, as I think most of you know, have had a small grants program underway. We have now made the awards, and I can announce those today. The first award is, remember we had two kinds of awards. One was about scalability, and the other was with regard to the infrastructure. This first award is focused on scalability, and it's about the development of a collaborative quality improvement consolidation center. You'll hear a lot more about this today, so I don't need to say more about it at this point. But we're absolutely delighted to be able to help move this project forward. The second is in the area of infrastructure, and you'll hear about this one at our first seminar in the new year. And it's focused, it's a mobile application for heart failure, and I think it's a nice balance between scalability and infrastructure between these two awards. And we're delighted to have these two very good teams working with us as we go forward. We very much expect that we'll be able to continue this award program into future years. And we want to recognize and thank the Office of the Vice President for Research helping us to co-sponsor this small grant award program. It's interesting as we talk to the folks who made proposals to us, in almost every case, what was requested was funding that would allow them to take an idea from an idea to the first test, or to take an already underway kind of project and actually put the learning health aspect into the program. Both of these activities, of course, are, from our perspective, a great use and a great way for us to gain experience as a collaboratory and what we can do working together. So now I'd like, with no further ado, to introduce my partner in crime here, Chuck Freeman, who's going to do a brief overview and introduce the seminar. Chuck?
Thank you, Doug. It's terrific to see everybody here. I am going to speak very briefly by way of introducing our two speakers. They actually asked me, so I just want you to know that showing you these slides again that you've already seen is their idea. Seriously, they asked that we sort of frame their presentation about the work that they are going to be doing to scale up their already very important and distinguished project by returning to a sort of basic portrayal of what the learning health system is, because that will set a context for their presentation. That is what you asked me to do, right? Okay. So with that in mind, I just want to present this very high-level conception of the learning health system, which, as I said at our kickoff meeting, is probably the only level at which everybody agrees on what it is, and maybe not even at this level. But I have found this way of describing the learning health system to be both helpful and relatively non-controversial. So first of all, to frame this up, and I'll kind of undo this, just about everybody agrees that the concept of a learning health system is tied to something cyclical, something repetitive, something that improves not all in one fell swoop, but rather through an iterative process, and over these successive iterations is the way in which things get better. There is also general agreement that a learning health system and this cyclic representation has two sides to it: a data to knowledge side, which is portrayed in blue, and then a feedback side where the knowledge that is created by analysis of data relevant to the problem at hand is translated into practice, and the resulting practice change is what then brings about the improvement over successive iterations, leading to this simple formula that better health equals D2K plus K2P. So that's framing slide number one. Framing slide number two is another way to think about what a learning health system is, and I also think this will be useful background to Skip and Greta's presentation to follow. These are the characteristics that around which there seems to be significant consensus that characterize a system, a health system that is a learning health system. Think about an inspector with a clipboard walking into a health system, trying to assess the extent to which that health system is a learning health system. I would argue that these are 5 items that might be on this clipboard. Is every patient's characteristic and experience available to learn from? Is best practice knowledge that results from analysis of these characteristics and experience immediately available to support decisions? Is this going on continuously, or is it bursty and episodic? In a learning health system, this is going on continuously. Is there an infrastructure platform supporting this? So these activities of analysis and feedback are able to be conducted with economy of scale. And finally, is all of this part of the culture? You ask people in this environment, if this inspector asks people in this environment, why are you doing this? The best answer they can give you is, it's who we are. This is what we do. So these are ideas, both the first slide portraying the learning health system as a cycle, and this slide proposing 5 characteristics that an inspector would use to figure out if a health system is a learning health system, are things I offer to you as background for our presentation today, which, as Doug said, is going to be a presentation of really the substrate for our first small grants award. Our speakers are going to present what they have done and their plans for the future. Obviously, if they had already done this work, they would not need a grant to do it. So we're very excited both about what they have done and what they are going to do. I give very short introductions. Our speakers are Dr. Darrell Campbell, also known as Skip, who is the project director of the Michigan Surgical Quality Collaborative, and Greta Krapohl, Dr. Greta Krapohl, who is the associate director of the MSQC. And I'd be delighted if the two of you would like to elaborate on your background and experience, but let me turn the podium over to you now,
Sir.
Greta.
Thank you very much. I have a friend coming in today that I served with in the military, and I said, "Oh, you're coming to Michigan in December, you better bring your parka." He's like, "Oh, it's nice here." It's like, "You're lucky." All right, I'll go ahead and get started. First of all, thanks for inviting us today. We're really excited to talk to you, and we're really honored to be one of the recipients of the grant. My name, as Chuck said, is Greta Krapohl. I'm a nurse by training. I have been here at Michigan and with the MSQC for the last 5 years. I have the honor of working with Dr. Campbell, who, like Chuck said, had retired as the chief medical officer at UMHS just last year, but we keep him dutifully employed. He is a transplant surgeon by training, but he's also been a pioneer in the field of patient safety and collaborative quality improvement. So a real honor to work with him. Today, we're going to be talking to you about our program at the Michigan Surgical Quality Collaborative. And I'd like to start off by saying that the Michigan Surgical Quality Collaborative is actually one of several collaborative quality improvements out of 19 that is sponsored by Blue Cross Blue Shield Michigan. We're over there in the NCRC. A lot of them are. And we have to do everything with the gut. So everything with a general surgeon, everything in this area. So you've got appendix, a gallbladder, anything with the bowel, mostly general surgeons, but also colorectal surgeons, cancer. We also deal with non-trauma emergency if your gut should burst or if you have an appendix that bursts or anything like that. And we look at all those outcomes of those patients. We also have an initiative to look at hysterectomy, which is the removal of the uterus. That is the #1 surgical procedure for women. We have some interesting data on that as well. And then I'll just bring your attention to one thing on the bottom. It says PSO. HRQ accredited us as a patient safety organization. And what that does, that came out of the Patient Safety Act in 2005, which said that we can share data and learn from data under federal protections of that data. So let's say we're looking at some really important data, looking at patients with lots of complications, morbidity, mortality data. Plaintiff's attorney would love to get their hands on that data, and this protects us from that, as well as looking at surgeon-specific outcomes. So we're really proud of that. We're 1 out of 82 in the country, and 3 in Michigan, 1 of 3 in Michigan. I'm going to go over a quick introduction over the next 30 minutes, a quick introduction. I want to talk to you about our cycle, a few things Chuck teed us up, but that makes our cycle unique. Then Dr. Campbell's going to bring in a patient example, a success that we've had, I think that you'll find interesting. We're going to go over a future direction, and finally, how the grant fits in. And then leave some time for questions as well. I want to just say that we are a great appreciation of Blue Cross Blue Shield, because not only do they fund our collaborative, but they fund all the hospitals that participate with us and put a nurse at every single hospital to collect the data as well. And here's our team here, and I've got my support group with me here. They're a great group of talented and very smart team of professionals that work with us, nurses, statisticians, researchers, administrators. Andy, Beth, and Matt are right there with Dr. Campbell over there, and they do a fantastic job. It takes a great team. We have 73 hospitals in the state of Michigan. We need about 25 more, and we'll have all the hospitals in Michigan. And that does not include the critical access hospitals, which are kind of their own, but we've had a lot of interest from them as well. That equates by the numbers. What that means is we've got 73 surgeons in each hospital, but really we have about 2,500 surgeons putting data in the database. And then we've got about almost 2,000 gynecologists, 1,000 anesthesiologists. We have nurse reviewers at every hospital, sometimes 1, 2, or 3, depending how big the hospital is. We've got monthly calls. We've got surgeon champion calls. We've got webinars. We've got quarterly meetings. We have 300 or 400 people at each of those meetings. So just a quick introduction of what we're all about. Now I'm just going to go over just quickly the learning cycle. We start here. It's like what Chuck teed up, just a little bit different in that we put in clinical inquiry. Then we collect, analyze, learn, discern, translate, and disseminate. And you see that interplay here with the hospitals. And then evaluate and support. The clinical inquiry part, we have questions. Questions like, prehabilitation. If you train for surgery, if you're getting a big surgery, if you're running a marathon, you're going to train for the marathon. How about a big surgery? And does that mean you have better outcomes? Clinical inquiry means if you're all these robots. When we first started 5 years ago, not many hospitals had robots. Now pretty much every hospital has a robot and a lot of surgeries. Does that mean better outcomes for patients? Maybe they get out of the hospital quicker, but are they readmitted? Those are the kinds of clinical inquiry. And Dr. Campbell's going to go over about surgical site infection and show you how we went through that cycle with surgical site infection. So what we collect is clinical variables. We don't use billing data. We are not using claims data. We're not using administrative data. The nurses are going into the operative report and they're looking to see what happened during the operation and seeing how the doctor wrote up, or the surgeon, how many lymph nodes they took out. So this data, I believe, is very powerful and different than the data you're going to see out of like a ProPublica report or something like that. So that is very rich, robust clinical data. We have over 220 variables. When we analyze the data, we actually have a dashboard, and Chuck talked about the continuous nature. We have a 24/7 dashboard. As soon as the patient's data goes in, you can look and see how your rates look, how that patient looks in relation to other hospitals. And the surgeon can go right down to their specific surgeries, how they look compared to other surgeons, not only in their hospital, not only in their system, but in the state. And this is a picture of what it looks like. This is just a trending graph, and this is a training. And if we have time at the end, I'd be happy. I can get this up for you. But in the interest of time, I didn't want to do that. And here too, this shows a ranking by hospital. You can see where your hospital ranks in relation to all 52. And on the side there, you can filter that. Well, I don't want to compare myself to the academic medical centers, or I just want to look at the general surgery procedures, take hysterectomy out. You can filter on all of that. All right, learn and discern. So what we do is we find the highest performing sites, let's say in surgical site infection. And we say, what are they doing that other hospitals aren't doing? Is there a protocol? Is there something that they're something that they're doing that the hospitals at the bottom side of those charts are not doing? And we actually get them all in a room and have them talk about it and learn from it and see. And some of them, one we just had a meeting, we had one system, and one hospital was at the very top, which was the worst for surgical site infection. And the other hospital was at the bottom, which was the very best. And they were in the same hospital system. So it's complicated. We also do site meetings and site visits and meetings. Dr. Campbell's going to go into a little bit more about that, and monitor data patterns and validate data. And I just want to have a story about validating data here. Is we looked at our morbidity rates of that, and that is the complication rates for surgery. And we were like, wow, this hospital has really high morbidity rates. This hospital is really good. What can we learn about these hospitals? One thing we learned in the data is that the hospitals with the highest rate of complication also had the best rate of follow-up by the nurses. So it just goes to show you that the question of punishing hospitals or using punitive measures for hospitals is very complicated. That is not always how it looks on the statistics report. And I know Andy dives into the data all the time, and we find these kinds of things that people don't think about. That's part of the learning. And I'm so glad you mentioned culture, because Dr. Campbell always uses this slide, and I hope I can give it justice the way he explains it. But the things on the structure part of it is what we do well and why we can operationalize what we do. We have financial support, we have reliable data, doctors and nurses believe it because they've collected it themselves. We're regional, they know us. We're multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. And we have nurses, trained clinicians collecting the data. The culture is what makes it, though. The culture that we set. We're not going to put up on the board the worst hospitals. Sometimes we put the best with their permission, but it's a culture of trust and a commitment to innovation and creativity. We're not going to, we're open to ideas and different things that you want to try or areas that we want to collect or analyze. And so Dr. Campbell calls it the blood oath that we take. You're not going to see a billboard saying, we're the best hospital in MSQC. No one's ever done that. And then finally, translate and disseminate. And we use many measures to communicate. We have a listserv, we have a website, we have toolkits. We have a learning center, an online learning module that we contract out. We have scheduled and conduct the site visits. We have the meetings we talked about. We publish the research. Dr. Campbell's going to talk more about that too. And then finally, evaluate and support. And I think this is really important. Coach, mentor, train, consult, monitor. Dr. Campbell has a quote that he says, and he goes, "We'd like to help you do what you do better." So we're going to try to help you figure that out, whether they write us and say, hey, is it true if you take chewing gum after bowel surgery, does that increase the bowel? Will you get out of the hospital quicker? What is the research on that? Even that means that we dive in, get the latest research, and let them know what that means. Look at some of the data. We collect that variable now, actually, too. All right, so Dr. Campbell's going to run us through an example so you can see how it works clinically, and then I'm going to follow up and go over some of the things we want to do with the grant.
Thanks, Greta. And my thanks also to the group for funding our research, which we're very, very appreciative of. So I'm going to do something that you may find somewhat disgusting. You've just had a large lunch, and I'm going to talk about colon surgery and how to clean the colon out prior to having colon surgery, and germs and infections. So I hope you can deal with that. So the title of this little segment is Big Data to the Bedside, because I think really we have a good resource in our database that has well over 400,000 cases at this point. And Greta described some of the variables that are in that database. And we've tried to use that database to inform a strategy for quality improvement. And we've done it in colectomy patients. And the reason that we've done it in colectomy patients is because, as I'm not telling you anything new, you're aware that the colon's full of germs. And so infection is a real possibility after colon surgery. In some cases, 20 to 25% of patients who are operated on get an infection that could be life-threatening. And we do a lot of colectomies throughout the state of Michigan. So the research I'm going to talk about right now and the implementation potentially has a big impact on the cases that we do. This particular data set I'm going to show you is about 6,000 very highly defined cases. And let me explain to you what we found when we looked at this particular subject. The first thing that we found was that when a surgeon does a colon operation, takes part of the colon out, you have to clean the colon out first and get as many of the bacteria out as you can. And many of you have had colonoscopies before, you kind of know what that's like. It's either for an enema or a cathartic that you take orally, but you get the colon cleaned out of most of the bacteria. But then the controversy becomes, is that enough? Or should we also give an oral antibiotic that's not absorbed? So it just sort of sits in the colon prior to surgery and further kills bacteria. And people were they didn't quite know what the answer to that was. So it turned out there was a natural experiment in our state. About half the surgeons were of the opinion just a cleaning out of the colon mechanically was enough. Another half thought, well, we should add oral antibiotics to the mix in order to lower infection rates. And so we had this natural experiment. We controlled for a variety of, this was a propensity match study, so we tried to control and make sure that we weren't confusing ourselves in this analysis, but I think we were able to do that. And so we wrote this paper, and the paper showed that in the black lines here, first of all, on the y-axis is the percentage of patients, and then you see these columns here that the percentage of patients that got an infection on the y-axis. And when there were no oral antibiotics that were administered, the infection rate was much higher than if there were oral antibiotics administered. So we got to a very fancy surgical meeting, the American Surgical, and made this presentation and showed all our colleagues this information. And then we began to think, well, we've got all this data. It's not just oral antibiotics that might be an important variable here. Let's do a logistic regression kind of approach to all these variables and see what pops out as process measures that might theoretically influence the overall result. So it's not just oral antibiotics. There may be very other ones as well. And so when we did that, we did find that there were 6 different process measures that influenced independently the infection rate. And what I'm showing you here is this adjusted odds ratio, and you see the red line is 1.0. Anything that's to the left of that favors lower infection rate. And the error bars, if the error bars don't cross 1, then that's statistically significant. So when we got all these variables, we saw that the first one was temperature. So if you maintain somebody's temperature, that seems to be helpful. If they're cold and freezing at the end of the operation, they're more prone to infection. The second one I mentioned, the bowel prep, we saw that was very significant as favoring lower infection rates. Then whether it was done laparoscopically or not was important. You know, with the laparoscopic, the tubes and the TV camera, this modern surgery, that was better also. A short duration of surgery was important. The faster you can do it, the less infection that you got. Postoperative glucose, less than a certain number on day 1, that means you were able to maintain the blood sugar level at under a reasonable level. That was important. And then this last 2, SCIP 2 means the Surgical Care Improvement Project. SCIP 2 is a list of 7 different antibiotics that are thought to be efficacious when given intravenously to add to the benefit of the oral antibiotics. And that's a federally published list of antibiotics that are thought, and there's this funny phrase that my friend Patch Dillinger uses in this. The way those antibiotics got on that list that would be helpful intravenously to use was eminence-based medicine rather than evidence-based medicine. There was a little evidence there, but a lot of it was because famous people got around a table and said, well, we think this and we think that. But so we wanted to test that, and I'll show you some data about that later where we did test it. But in any event, if you use an intravenous antibiotic as well as the oral antibiotic, and it was on that list of 7 antibiotics, that was helpful. But then SCIP 1 is another measure that the feds have put out that, they advocated that we use that, was that the antibiotics should be given within 60 minutes of the start of the operation. So the level in the plasma of antibiotics would be very high at the time of surgery. But we didn't find that was particularly important in our database. So in any event, the 6 variables that I just described here are all independently associated with good results here. That's what the logistic regression is telling us. And so we thought, well, let's call this a bundle. Let's say, and we would hypothesize that if they're all independently important, then there should be an additive effect of some kind. So what happens when patients have either none of the variables here or all of them in terms of their infection rate? And that's what we wanted to look at. And the next slide shows that. This is the bundle score. So on the y-axis, you see the adjusted SSI, that's surgical site infection. That's what that means. And then bundle compliance, that means the average number of these elements per patient at a given hospital. And so if you only had 0 or 1 of these elements here, the infection rate was around 20%. But progressively, as you went on, it was a remarkable graph. I've never seen anything like this in my life. But if you've had fewer and fewer infections. So if you had all 6 variables, there was 105 patients in that category. There weren't any infections in that group. So we're onto something here. We have identified a group of what we call them process measures that we could advocate to our surgeons out in the community. This is real world stuff because these are 90% of them are community hospitals. They didn't know this. Nobody knew it until we looked at our data. And so our job then in this implementation thing is to take this information we got from our analysis, we believe it, and then we promulgate it to all the different hospitals to see if we can get them to buy into this. And so what you see in this slide is hospitals on the x-axis and the average bundle score on the y-axis. And you can see, first of all, if you look over to the right, there are some hospitals that are doing pretty well. Their average, for instance, at the highest level was 4.5 of these bundle elements per case. And then on the left side, you see some hospitals where they didn't get the memo, and they're not really doing this in the way that we wanted them to do. So the idea, in the learning health approach here, and what we do in MSQC is to get the group on the right side to sit with the group on the left side and talk about barriers and talk about why we might or might not be able to promote our strategy that was based on all this data. So that's been a process we've been doing for a while. So now, I hate to show you this picture. Surgeons hate to see this on the left side. That's an infection after you did the operation, and then it all falls apart and pus comes out and it's terrible. So on the right side, though, in order to prevent that, we got all the evidence together. And we have these quarterly meetings where we sit in a room just like this, but there's 300 surgeons and nurses sitting around talking about this. And we talk about the evidence. What is the evidence that's out there? Now, we generate our own evidence too, but what are some of the evidence out there? We bring in famous speakers from all over the place. And in red, you can see these are the bundle elements. So we had experts from all over the place come in and talk to us about these various aspects. So we're sure that the folks that in our collaborative actually have exposure to the best evidence that there is out there. And then that slide set and all the information, references and so forth goes on our webpage. So you can easily go back and look at it whenever you want to. It's there for your perusal. And I think that's been very, very important. Now, Greta mentioned something about site visits, and I think site visits are fun and they're important. What that means is that myself and Greta and a variety of other people in our team will actually go into a hospital that, say, is doing well or sometimes is doing badly, and we'll sit around and sort of kick the tires and talk to them about what their issues are. If you have some barriers to implementation, what are the barriers and how can we help you with that? And that's a sort of level of qualitative information that is very rich. It's not just looking at a computer screen and analyzing all these hundreds of thousands of cases. That's important. It's also important to get some face validity and talk to people who really do this kind of work and ask them, what do you think about this? Does this make sense to you? Is this something that you think you would want to do? And how are you able to get to the point where the surgeons, who are taking care of these patients will actually do this stuff? Because surgeons can be very stubborn, and they were trained 30 years ago in a certain way of doing it, and it takes an act of not even an act of Congress could get them to change their practice unless they believe it, unless they see something that came out of their own organization. This is a picture of us. We all get in the bunny suits and we go into the operating room and we talk to the nurses in the operating room. We talk to some patients. Sometimes we talk to the surgeons. And that I found to be a very rich source of data. If I had more time, I would tell you about some of the little pearls that we've found when we have done that you wouldn't necessarily get out of the database. So it fills this important gap. I think part of it's team building and getting this culture going, but I mentioned this, it's got face value. We've done quite a few of these so far. So another thing that's important is to get a panel of surgeons together at our quarterly meetings. This is an example of a panel we had a while ago. All of the folks on this stage here are colon surgeons, except for one who's a pharmacist. But the idea was, let's put a provocative question out there. How do you do this? And have them back and forth, argue about it in front of the 300 of the rest of us. And that can be very, very important to a question and answer session and so forth. And I think you never get this at a national meeting. Now, the meetings that I go to in surgery are the stuffiest things you can imagine. They're all old surgeons like me, and they sit in an auditorium at a fancy hotel, and they will listen to a presentation for 7 minutes, and then there's 5 minutes of discussion. And then that paper gets published a year later someplace. And so the opportunity to disseminate that is very limited. Different from what I'm showing you here, where people are doing this every 3 months, and they're talking about these issues that are important to us. So now back to the colectomy bundle. Here you see all these different bundle elements. So what we recognize relatively recently is that of the 6 bundle elements, some of them are easier to implement than others. Now, for example, short duration of surgery. Well, so what am I going to do about that? Somebody's a slow surgeon, might be a very good surgeon, but he's a slow surgeon. I can't whip him and make him operate faster if that's not the way he usually does it. And I shouldn't. And the same thing is true for whether or not they use a laparoscopic approach rather than the traditional open approach to surgery. That takes years and decades for people to learn a new technique like that. So even though it comes out as important in the data, it's hard to change it. And then another one of these variables, the normothermia, the one where we try to get people warmed up and make sure they're not cold during the surgery. That one was already at a very high level. People kind of got that. It was important, but it wasn't that hard to do, and they got that. So those 3 of these 6 process measures, we didn't change a lot of them. But the other 3 were actionable. And that means that with our educational efforts, we can actually do something, we think. And I'm going to show you some data that this is, I think, a very tangible evidence that this kind of approach can work. So on the y-axis, you're seeing a percentage, and on the x-axis, the time interval. And there are 3 lines here. And they represent 3 of those bundle elements. And they're all going up. And I don't know if you think that's up enough or not, but it's a pretty darn good increase when you're talking about 73 some hospitals. And one of them on the bottom, how clearly it comes out. Well, let's start at the top. One of them is the oral antibiotics idea. So we started off with less than 50% were doing oral antibiotics, and now we're up to what, 70% of the patients are getting an oral antibiotic, to a little 70 plus, and it keeps going up. So something's happening that we convinced the people that needed to be convinced. And the second one was the normal glycemia idea of monitoring their blood sugar intraoperatively very carefully and making sure it doesn't get too high. And that has gone up 20+% of time over the period of time. And then the bottom one, I think, is really important because this is a specific antibiotic combination that we looked at in our initial data. Remember I told you in the SCIP2 group, there were 7 antibiotics, an eminence-based medicine thing. And when we looked at each one of those antibiotics individually, what it showed was that there were only 3 that added additional value to the oral antibiotics. Only 3, not the other 4 didn't seem to do that. So we started pushing one of those 3 that was helpful, cefazolin metronidazole, because it was cheap, there's not much resistance to it, and we thought, well, that's the best antibiotic. We showed that it works and it adds value, so we're going to push that. And that is that red line there, and I show it to you a little more graphically right here. Now it's the blue line on the top, cefazolin metronidazole. You can see how that's gone up dramatically over time. And nobody else nationally has been pushing this. That's what we pushed here. So I don't think it's part of a national trend. And here's some of the other antibiotics. When we first started this thing, there were we looked at 123 different antibiotic combinations were given for the same operation. That's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous that there's no consensus on using the evidence to use the right antibiotics. But now we've focused in on this one antibiotic to give intravenously, and I'm just showing you it's not 100%, but it's going up. And that, to me, is evidence that this whole approach is working. Now, here's the final relationship here. You see this SSI bundle. As it goes up over time, the total SSI has gone down. Now, you can say, okay, that's an association. I agree. That is an association, but it's a pretty striking one, I think. It's hard to do, randomized controlled double-blind trials in this kind of work. So, but what we see is there's this relationship, increasing bundle compliance and reduced total SSIs. And then we did a little, Andy put this together for me. We divided the hospitals into tertiles. That means a third, and a third. And so we looked at it by compliance of the bundle package. And you can see on your right, that tertile of hospitals that had the highest bundle compliance had the lowest SSI rate, and conversely, on the left side, the tertile of hospitals that had the lowest bundle compliance had the highest SSI rate. So I'm trying to convince you that this was very meaningful and we think beneficial. So this is the final thing. I kind of showed you this, but this is the SSI total by year going down, 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 and that's exactly what we wanted it to do. And then here's a really important slide, because we looked at we developed a composite score for quality in colon surgery, which I haven't got time to show you what that all is. But each one of these little dots is a different patient, and they're being categorized based on their composite quality score. On the x-axis, the farther to the right, towards 100, you get the better quality as we judge it. And on the y-axis is the total episode payment, which we have from claims data. That I wish I had time to tell you about that, but I don't. But we can look at the total episode payment for that colon surgery, and you see the slope is going in this direction, which means that as the colon quality gets better, it's less expensive. It's not more expensive, it's less expensive. And so this is a powerful motivator for the federal government to support quality improvement and for Blue Cross Blue Shield to continue to do what they've been doing. So stop there, and then Greta, finish up.
Good. I think we're right on time. I'll just close us up with a few things. One is the future direction. I hope that pulled together the cycle and the example of how we use the cycle in the future. 3 things that we're working on right now is leveraging technology better. And I know a lot of you are IT professionals, more of the patient-anchored care. And then this is where we got the grant. And it's exactly like Chuck said, we've been wanting to do this, and we've got a lot of interest. Leveraging technology, our nurses right now, about 30% of the data comes in via data integration. The other 70% is conducted manually. We'd like to flip that. We're working on that. Matt's working on that right now. I think we'll make great strides on that. 2 is patient anchoring. We have we got a grant on opioids. It's also funded by the state. And what we've done, this is a picture of our workstation here, and we've added an opioid category to find out after surgery, how many opioids do you get? Do you get refills? How much do you actually use? I'm sure you're familiar with the opioid crisis, and the patient's going to respond to some of this. So this is our first time that we'll have patient giving us information on this as well. And then finally, there's many, well, they're not many. Right here, the red dots are where there are other surgical collaboratives all using different databases, platforms. South Carolina is using exactly ours. And what we'd like to do is bring them all together. And that area right there is what that grant is all about. We'd like to take all of the infrastructure and coordination that we've done and bring that all together under one learning health system. Our grant had 3 endpoints. The first one being that we'd have an e-learning toolkit. So we're going to put those things together, like explaining value or the ROI for collaborative, and how much does it cost if a state wanted to try a collaborative. Dr. Campbell was just in enemy territory right before the game in Ohio, and they're interested in starting one there. So we'll have a toolkit that we can export to them. And that was part of the grant. And number two was that we'd have an infrastructure, like in that Venn diagram right in the middle, that we'd be able to put all the data in together, create the consolidation center, we called it in the grant. And then finally, that we'd have launch the first collaborative improvement conference for perioperative care surgery for other regions that are interested. And Beth has a database of 32 people of organizations that have already contacted us. So we're hoping we'll have good turnout for that, and that'll be in October 2017. We've already got that planning underway. And that is all I have. That's all we have. And we have a few minutes for questions, I believe. Thanks for your attention.
Are there any plans for exposing these data to patients? I can answer that.
I think you have to use the microphone.
Okay.
And could I ask that people who have questions do so from the microphone?
Do you want to repeat the question?
I think we're recording this.
Sure.
And also state your name and rank.
My name is Mark Schlissel, and I'm Steve Gendler. I'm from the HITS organization, and I was asking if these data, which are very intriguing, can somehow be exposed to patients so that they can go to hospitals that have high bundle scores.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's something I believe in very strongly, that patients have a right to know what they're getting into and to the quality of the care that they are about to receive. The question is, how do you get there? And how do you provide information that is not only reliable, but could be understood in a meaningful way by the patient? I think that has to happen between the doctor and the patient in the office. So the doctor has to be able to have the information. When you talk about surgeon-specific reporting or hospital-specific reporting, that's a very complicated subject. It has to be done well. There's certain things that I think we can report and we should report nationally. Those are never events. Those are things like operating on the wrong leg, or egregious mistakes that should never, under any circumstances, happen. That should be publicly available. Now, they're very rare, but when you get down to how well does a hospital perform, what we've actually found in surgery is that hospitals, sometimes they do really well in one area, they don't do so well in another area. And there's very few hospitals that are good in absolutely everything. So it depends on what the case is, and so you have to know that information. With regard to the example I showed, for instance, it's not absolute. There are general trends here. So it may be that somebody who does it a little bit differently than I've explained and doesn't use too many of our bundle elements still has pretty good results, and we've seen that. So I wouldn't want to have that information get out there at this point without an awful lot of explanation to people. But I believe so it's kind of an evolutionary process, I believe. When ProPublica reported their surgeon-specific report cards not too long ago, it created a huge flap. The data was horrible. It was and they ultimately said, well, we know it's horrible data, but we just thought it was important to initiate the conversation, and it'll get better over time. And I'm not sure that's the right way. I don't think we're quite at the point right now where we could get this information out. The second part of that is, if you start saying, well, St. Joe's Hospital is the best hospital in the MSQC collaborative, so you should all go there. That sort of destroys the culture that we've been trying to work within our collaborative, because then it gets into a competitive kind of thing, and the individual hospitals within the collaborative are saying, well, you know, we're going to start fudging the data, and we're going to start and we're not going to share all our best practices with these other guys, because now they've used it for an advantage to get more patients. So you don't want to destroy the culture either with it. And I think we're still working through how to do that.
Hi, thank you for that. My name is Patty Andruski, and I work for the Office for Health Equity and Inclusion. And this is fascinating data, because I think of all of the doctors who come to our office asking questions about health disparities, and can we look at surgical outcomes from a health disparities lens. And I saw here that you do, in fact, collect demographics of your patients. So have you done that in the past for anyone? And would you be willing to work with our office on looking at some of those?
Yeah, I think we have, not in exactly the way that you described, but what we have looked at is patients who receive Medicaid, regardless of what their race or ethnicity is, patients receiving Medicaid, how do they compare in terms of quality outcomes in this state to private payers? And we matched them for age, and we wrote a paper about this. And what we saw in that particular paper was that the folks who were getting Medicaid had a lot worse health to start with than the private payers. That shouldn't surprise anybody. They hadn't had access to medical care in the way that they should. And the second thing is the outcomes were bad. They were worse than the private payer age-matched cohort. And so that doesn't surprise me either, because they start off in lousy shape, and then it's harder to do a good operation on them. And so we've looked at it from a socioeconomic perspective and made the point that with Medicaid expansion, that was going to be a big problem, because we've got more and more patients who haven't had access to care before, and it's going to be more expensive to give them good care. And that now, who knows what's going to happen to Medicaid expansion, but at least at that point, that was the point that we've made. And so I'm very interested in that particular area, and I'd be happy to, work with you. And if you have interesting questions you think we could help you answer, we'd be happy to do that. Yeah, another interesting thing we've been working on recently is, I'm not sure if we're completely finishing with this, but we got the interesting idea. Maybe air pollution has something to do with surgical outcomes. And you could hypothesize, for instance, that if you had a lot of pollutants in the air, sulfur dioxide or something, your chances of getting a postoperative pneumonia or postoperative sepsis might be higher. And that, then you have to kind of tease out the other socioeconomic factors that would be associated with people living in an industrial area next to a big factory. But we're kind of working through that. And I think there may be some association there. So that's another area of interest. When you have the data, you can answer a lot of questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jane Blumenthal from the Taubman Library. I'm veering a little bit off your direct subject, but in response to Steve's question earlier, you were talking about the difficulty of releasing the data to patients in a way that they can make sense of it. And with the talk of the Precision Medicine Initiative and a whole lot of data gathering and released for individuals, it seems to me this is going to be a bigger and bigger problem. And do you know of anyone who's working on how to make very complex data understandable to patients?
That's a great question. And I wish I had shown you a picture of this, but part of our grant, so we got this grant from the CMS Innovation Center to look at the idea of prehabilitation, as Greta mentioned, is, can we get people in better shape prior to surgery, and will that translate into better outcomes? So part of that is to develop a risk calculator based on all our hundreds of thousands of cases in Michigan. And it's an iPad app. So it's in production right now. We have this. So you can take that iPad and fill out a questionnaire that's incredibly easy. These are little check boxes that almost anybody would know. Is the patient severely malnourished or not? What's their functional status? And can they get out of bed by themselves, et cetera, et cetera? They smoke. How old are they? All these things that you can get pretty easily. That can be done at the bedside. It doesn't have to even be done by a doctor. It can be done by, an aide or a nurse or a family member. Really could help you fill this out. And then when you finish this 5 minutes worth of data entry, you see what looks like a speedometer, and the speedometer has a needle on it. And if that speedometer goes to the 20-mile-an-hour area, well, okay, that's kind of safe. It's not going to be a real risky thing for you to drive around at 20 miles an hour. If the speedometer is 88, that means you're going pretty fast. And that's something that I think an ordinary person can kind of relate to that and say, this, given all the variables that we put in here, I'm in a risky area in terms of having my operation. It also can show you what is your chance not only of dying or having a complication, but also what's my chance of ending up in a skilled nursing facility for the next 3 months or something like that. And that data is available. So I think, yes, we're trying to translate this kind of thing at the individual level based on our big data in order to help patients. And one important part of it is maybe we don't want to do this operation. And that surgeons frequently get backed into a corner by family and by, grandpa is got a perforated colon. They're in the operating room and they look bad. And should we do this operation or not? It's kind of hard to walk away and do nothing. But at the same point, if you look at the data, the survival from that is less than 1%. Now, we probably shouldn't do that. That's a waste of resources, basically. And so I think this kind of risk assessment at the bedside, based on the data, would be directly pertain to your question. How can you make this into something somebody can understand?
What was the name of the app?
Well, it's part of the grant right at the moment. I don't know if it has an app. It's our risk calculator, we call it. So, yeah. Hey, man.
Hi, Skip. Van Harrison from the Department of Learning Health Sciences. The Squire criteria, when they publish quality improvement, recommends when you publish quality improvement studies, has a section where you're supposed to talk about the context. I'm interested in your thoughts on why you folks have been able to be successful. What contextual things in your environment have allowed you to succeed, where there's many other states and they don't have collaboratives and this kind of activity is not occurring. There were threads of this in things that you said, but why aren't there 50 other collaboratives?
Well, that's a good question, Dan. The first part of that I would say is that a regional orientation as opposed to a national one, it's much easier to do these kinds of things on a regional basis. When the feds or somebody else tries to do this, it becomes so diffuse and nobody knows anybody, and you lose your sense of autonomy, which is really important. Somebody's telling you to do something, and we recognize, as there's a great book that many of you read by Daniel Pink, it's called Drive, and he talks about what motivates people, particularly healthcare workers, to do things. It's not pay for performance, but it's three things. One thing is a sense of mastery in what you're doing, that you develop that. Another one is a sense of autonomy. But the third one is a sense of purpose, that you're doing something because it's the right thing to do and you want to do something important with your life. Those three things. The money is there, but it's not as important. So I think whenever groups try to start something and it's based on pay for performance, is doomed to failure, if you ask me. So that's number one. Second thing is this whole idea about culture is really, really important. That idea that we're not trying to get ahead, no competitive advantages here. And we're not trying to get rich on this, and we know each other, and we're not going to blab to the newspapers about some hospitals doing very badly. And it's a culture of trust. And if you can establish that culture of trust, and you can do that because this is regional. We all know each other. Half the people in our group trained at Michigan or someplace close by. I've been in all these organizations for years, and I know most of them. And I think that personal relationship part of it is that you get on a regional thing is much better. And then finally, really, really importantly, we have been able to partner with a third-party payer. Usually doctors and third-party payers don't like each other very much, and they are all always in lawsuits about, payment stuff. So if you can get to a point where you can have a relationship with the payer and say to the payer, it's your responsibility also to do something good with all the money that you've got, and they buy it, then they support this stuff. So they've supported every single penny of what we've done. And I think that, regardless of your political persuasion, the new regime is going to like that story because the federal government didn't support any of this stuff you just saw. Not one nickel of it. This all came from the private side, from the third-party payers. And so that's really important. And I think trying to convince the third-party payers that they need to support this is important. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Greta wanted me to remind everybody that the Blues don't know anything about the individual hospitals or individual surgeons. That part of our patient safety organization precludes them knowing anything. They know aggregate results. That's all they see. Yeah. And I think that's an important part of it. Yeah, Chuck.
Skip and Greta, thank you for such a terrific presentation. And I'll in these remarks / questions, I'm going to address what I think are some really important things that you brought up. To this point about starting on a regional level, I just can't emphasize the importance of that, and it brings to the foreground exactly what your small grant is seeking to do. You're going to be testing the hypothesis that if these collaboratives have to start on a smaller level of scale, can they in fact compose into a virtual learning network that exists at a higher level of scale? Mm-hmm. And just as you said, you can't start at that higher level of scale and work downward. You've absolutely, I think demonstrated that. We're going to see if it can go the other way. That's why we're so excited about the work you're doing. Now to another point where I'm actually going to ask you a question. Okay. The point you dwelt on the issue of causation, and you looked at your slides and you said, well, this isn't randomized controlled work. We see one thing going up and we see another thing going down. So we see a relationship. And we see over a period of time that we are achieving our goal of reducing these surgical site infections. How deep down in your heart of hearts, how important do you think it is to demonstrate a causal relationship of the nature that a randomized trial can do? Or are you content to show this relationship and improvement as a measure of success of what you're doing?
I'm the latter. I'm very content with this observational inferences that we get from big pieces of data. That's I think there was a great article in the New York Times this weekend about the whole issue of dental flossing and whether you really needed to have a randomized controlled trial to show that dental flossing was, some of them evidently, there are some trials that said it didn't do much good, and they use this interesting quip in there about there's never been a randomized controlled trial proving that you need a parachute when you jump out of a plane. But we pretty much know the answer to that. So I think we can. I'm very comfortable with drawing inferences from these big pieces of data. Now, if I'd showed you that slide, the SSI rate was going up as the bundle compliance went up, I'd be in a fix. That would be a big problem for me and for everybody in our people who support our activities to explain that. And luckily that's not what we saw. So there may be other factors, and there probably are many other factors that we're not showing. We just are able to have this one glance at it from the evaluation that we did that seems to work for us. So I'm comfortable with that. Okay, well, thank you again for allowing us to present our data, and we're around. So if anybody thinks of questions later on, you can email us or call us.